Welcome to PPL PWR Social Club, our daily digital event space where we can catch up, learn something new, and just check in with each other during the COVID-19 lockdown. Today we have Alex Talbot talking about community-led housing. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, James. I've done a quick little presentation this morning, so I'll just share that. Hopefully it should be somewhat informative. Can you all see that?
Yes, community-led housing, CLH.
Yeah. So I'm going to use the abbreviation CLH a little bit, just because community-led housing gets quite tiring to say endlessly. So that's what that stands for, but I've tried to avoid any other acronyms. Okay. Right. What's going on? Great. So this is what I'm going to talk today. It's got sort of three little sections. What is community-led housing? As many people probably won't have heard of it before. A sort of working definition, a very, very brief history, and some of the forms it takes today. I then thought I'd just have a little talk about what I'm doing in my day-to-day, both in my voluntary role and in my professional role, as I think it's a good example and gives a good sort of overview of community-led housing, sort of some of what you might get involved with, some of how it sort of works. And then I'll give a wrap it up with a little brief couple of thoughts about the community-led housing sector, where it might go, what's exciting, and what some of the challenges might be. I hope that all sounds all right. Okay, so this is currently a working definition being used by our council and the Greater London Authority, so basically the Mayor's Office. It sort of tries to keep as simple as possible while sort of covering all the points. And so the first one is meaningful community engagement and consent occurs throughout the development process. Communities do not necessarily have to initiate a scheme or build the homes themselves, though many do. So first of all, this is about communities coming together and looking to solve their housing issues. So that might be to do with affordability. It might be due to a lack of suitable types of houses in their local area. It might be to do with protecting certain types of houses or even community assets like pubs in a certain area. But fundamentally, it's about communities coming together and being involved with the scheme. And as it says, they don't have to build or develop the scheme themselves, but many do. So the second looks beyond just building or developing houses, and it looks to what happens once you have either houses in place or a mixture of houses and sort of other social infrastructure. And it says there is a presumption that the community group or organisation will take a long-term formal role in the ownership, stewardship or management of the homes. So a really key feature, and something that sometimes gets a little brushed over, is that community-led housing isn't just about the building, it's about the ongoing management and organisation of that built space after it's created. So that would be, in terms of housing, sort of doing all the sort of housing management functions, such as maybe collecting rent, doing the repairs, organising all that, and that's all done within a sort of community structure using sort of democratic processes. And the last one is the benefits of the scheme to the local area and or specified community group are clearly defined and legally protected in perpetuity. I didn't know what that word perpetuity meant before I sort of got involved with all this. It means sort of forever. So if it's protected in perpetuity, it's protected forever. And more often than not, what that means is that community groups are trying to build affordable housing that's both genuinely affordable, most often linked to incomes and protected from what's called market speculation, such as basically rising and falling house prices based on sort of the market value. And that affordable housing is protected in perpetuity, so it remains affordable forever, which is one of the really, really essential points about community-led housing, and why I think it's a really amazing sort of product and amazing thing to get involved with. Very, very brief, a skip over the historical origins. So one sort of path of its origins to do with the sort of housing association and cooperative movement of the 1960s, 70s and 80s in the UK. About the Victorian times, councils and the state started to realise it needed to build cheaper housing to help deal with sort of urban problems. So quite slowly at first, but increasingly with scale and volume. The state, often sort of initiated by local authorities, started building a lot of housing. And this is known as council housing today. It's very much shaped the landscape of Britain. However, by the 1960s, there were definitely concerns about whether the state was as responsive as it should be to the people that lived in the housing. Often the state acts quite a monolithic or bureaucratic way, and the housing association movement sort of was born out of community groups essentially looking to develop low rent social housing themselves. Today, housing associations are massive, and they've definitely grown over the 40 years. But that sort of early movement was all about communities coming together and building affordable housing. Another sort of movement which has a much longer history is the idea of sort of ongoing to the self-build movement. So I'm sure you've all watched Grand Designs, and that sort of a strand of building your own housing definitely has contributed to community-led housing and has a really, really long history, obviously, in Britain. And the final one is sort of inspirations from abroad. A certain type of community-led housing called community land trusts were sort of first developed in America, which sort of as part of the black rights movement. And they themselves sort of borrowed ideas from the formation of Israel in terms of collectively owning land, keeping it subsidized for a long time, and being able to build affordable housing because you were taking the cost out of the land. Other sort of foreign influences have been the ideas that we see in Holland and Germany, whereby municipalities and councils would usually try and buy land at subsidized rates and then offer it to community groups to build out housing, essentially enacting community-led housing. So what does community-led housing look like today in Britain? Well, there are a number of different forms. So community land trusts, which I'm sort of involved with, are the idea of sort of getting a subsidized piece of land, either free or much cheaper than you would normally be able to buy it, and essentially locking in that subsidy for a long period of time in perpetuity, and then either selling or renting at affordable rates to people. But very critically, in terms of the sort of when a community land trust selling a property to somebody, that same individual can't then resell the property on into the open market. It has to sell it back to the community land trust, which keeps that housing affordable for in perpetuity. Cooperatives have a longer history in community land trusts in Britain. We're definitely part of that housing association movement. But cooperatives are essentially, in the housing context, are housing that is owned by members. So typically you might have a housing development. Some of our social housing got turned into cooperatives that maybe has 100 houses in it, and each household will own a stake within the management and ownership of that cooperative. And that's another type of community-led housing. Co-housing is sort of the third recognised type, and this is essentially where you have developments that have a specific focus on having shared living space. So we're not talking about student halls, and we're not talking about some of the sort of young urban professional housing that has tiny dorm rooms and big cafeterias. We're talking about purpose-built flats that are usually quite small, with focuses on community gardens that you come together with, community kitchen facilities, community shared facilities, and the whole design of it is based around communal living in the sort of management and the way that you sort of interact with the people that live there. The final type, definitely recognised type, is self-help. So this is quite often enacted in urban areas where there's some sort of maybe derelict housing, hard to let housing, hard to sell housing. Thinking about certain streets, maybe in Liverpool or maybe northern cities particularly. And this is often enacted with the help of the council, whereby they sell these houses on at very, very cheap rates, and people themselves come to sort of update the houses, refurbish them, make them more thermally efficient, and through that they then come to own the house. So they buy it for very, very cheap, they put in the work, they turn it into something that's more habitable, and they get to own that house. And that's called self-help in terms of community-led housing. The last two is obviously that idea of self-build and tenant management organisations. So the first one is where tenants in social housing, in council housing, have the right to manage their estate. You've been allowed to do that since 1994. And the second is sort of self-build, which is your sort of typical grand designs. The reason they're both in brackets is obviously they don't quite conform to those 3 points I put up as a sort of working definition. So tenant managed organisations are sort of taking on stock and managing it, and self-build doesn't really look to protect it in perpetuity per se. So I just thought I'd explain a little bit about what I do on a day-to-day, both in my professional role and my voluntary role, just to give a little bit of a flavour as to what the sector looks like. So amongst other things, something I do at Croydon Council is the community-led housing site disposal programme. And this is trying to take small bits of land that are often council-owned and put them up on a website that the Mayor of London hosts, and make them available for groups to come forward and put a bid in to try and develop it themselves, to essentially enact community-led housing. So far we've done one, and we're currently coming a bit closer to putting up our second, and we've got a pipeline of hopefully 5 or 6. And this is all about trying to empower communities within Croydon to come together, put in bids, and deliver genuinely affordable housing that works for the needs of those local communities. So that's sort of part of my day job, and it quite sort of readily looks at what local authorities up and down the country are doing right now to try and encourage community-led housing, which obviously produces good benefits for them because it produces more affordable housing. Within my voluntary role, I work, I'm part of a community land trust that's trying to build obviously affordable housing in Christchurch Road, which is Brixton Hill, Streatham Hill, if anybody knows it. Within this, I sit on a steering group with about another 30 people, and we, together with a specialist sort of community-led housing builder called London CLT, are trying to essentially develop community-led housing. And we've managed to purchase the land from TfL, and we're currently working with architects and various other sort of built environment specialists to work towards submitting an application for planning that will see around 30 genuinely affordable homes linked to about 1/3 of the local income there. So that would put them well below anything else that you could sort of buy in that local area. And so that's just a sort of summary of some things that I'm sort of involved with, and it gives you a sort of good range of what it looks like from both the council side in terms of trying to encourage it, and what sort of maybe a day-to-day looks like in being involved in a community land trust. The final slide I've got is a little bit of consideration about community land trusts, community-led housing, looking into some of the opportunities, some of the challenges that essentially face the sector. The sector at the moment contributes less than 1% of total housing output for the UK, but it's a growing sector. There's funding behind it, and there's real ambition within the sector to see that number grow to maybe about 5%. And so what are some of the things, in my opinion, that could really sort of maybe help or even challenge that ability to get there? An interesting development is that we're seeing for more councils acting essentially as a lender. So community-led housing, like all types of housing, has to borrow money from essentially a bank to be able to build the housing. There are grants available, and often the land can be sold quite cheap, but at the end of the day, you need to raise a lot of money to build homes. And one very exciting thing that's just successfully been done in South Hams District Council is that the council are stepping in and lending to community-led housing developments. This has the benefit of providing a little bit of money for the council. It gives the council more of a stake in the development, but importantly, it can also be done at interest rates that are much lower than what community-led housing groups could get from a bank. This helps make sure that the housing that is produced is as affordable as possible. The government, in I think it was 2013-14, committed quite a large sum of money towards helping community-led housing groups get grants to develop community-led housing. one of the key challenges for the sector is making sure that this gets refunded. There are currently questions, even before the COVID-19 restrictions, as to whether this grant would be extended beyond April 2021. And there's a massive campaign currently undergoing from all sides of the sector to try and make sure that money is committed past that amount, past that date, and that more money is put into it. A really exciting feature is a really exciting possibility for the future is modular housing. Modular housing has quite a long history in Britain. A lot of the 1960s council estates were known as prefab, which essentially meant they were built off-site and developed sort of attached to steel frames. That sort of died down due to safety concerns, but is sort of roaring back, and it really offers the opportunity to build really, really thermally efficient, sustainable housing that can be done on quite a cheap scale if we can get the demand there. Community-led housing, together with councils and housing associations, really need to be working together more to try and build up the demand for this type of housing, so that factories have enough sort of demand to build this type of housing off-site and develop it. But if it can be done effectively, it can really help drive down the actual construction cost, which, as I said, everything that drives down the cost of developing these schemes makes sure that the housing is as affordable as possible. Another future development is looking at planning. Often when you look in a local plan, which is a local authority's planning statement, it sort of tells you what you'll get permission for and what you won't. There's all types of definitions about types of affordable housing. Social rented is something that a lot of people have heard of, but shared ownership and affordable rent are other types of affordable housing. The sector at the moment is pushing really hard to try and get community-led housing and some of the affordable housing products that it delivers embedded into planning sort of specifications. And what that has the ability to do is when developers, private developers, come forward with large schemes, say 400 homes, the hope is that they can give a section of that, maybe 50 homes, over to community-led housing groups to develop themselves into genuinely permanently affordable housing. Sort of fifth one I've written down here is not just housing. Some community-led, I think there's going to be a greater focus on the future about integrating really important assets within communities. So in a rural context, it might be the village pub, but it might be anything you could really think of, and sort of developing that into this community-led housing ethos and trying to combine not just housing, but also sort of community spaces, or even sort of shops if that's what the local community need. And there's sort of interesting things happening in that space. More exciting partnerships. I think community-led housing groups often do partner with housing associations to make sure that they can actually develop it, and it's a little bit less risky. And I think there's a massive future for more exciting and more fruitful and robust partnerships between community-led housing organisations and other developers of affordable housing, mainly housing associations and councils. And there's also a lot of private institutional money floating around the world at the moment, from hedge funds, sort of pension funds. Interest rates are really low globally, and that means that there's a lot of money from private institutions that's looking for a home to make returns. And that offers another really exciting opportunity for community-led housing groups to sort of tie into that. And the sort of last one I've put is an increasing awareness, particularly around some of the communal living aspects that I talked about in co-housing, about some of the benefits that can bring. If we think about one of the biggest crises we're facing at the moment, which is ageing populations, underfunded social care, and an inability as a society to really care properly for people in old age, dedicated co-housing schemes that really focus on communal living with maybe mixed age sort of residents involved offer a real, in my opinion, a real shining light and an ability to actually house people effectively that's going to help them age more effectively and age with less sort of health conditions and less issues of loneliness. So I think all of those are sort of some exciting prospects, potentially some challenges, and potentially some opportunities for the sector going forward. That's it. I hope you understood it roughly.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex. Really informative to hear how these schemes come together and some of the different advantages and disadvantages. And yeah, I'm pretty sure we're going to have some interesting questions. So, Ollie or Dad, do you guys have any questions? Because let me know I do.
there's sort of a lot of things going through my head. This is the first time I've sort of delved into this any more than just like chatting to someone. But one thing I spoke to a friend about was one planet building policy that they have in Wales. So it's I haven't read it at all, but she was sort of saying it's if you can prove that what you're building is for the greater good and is eco-friendly, sustainable, all those things, that you can sort of fast track some of the planning applications and make things happen a lot quicker. She said that was in Wales, and I don't know if you've heard of it or whether there's anything like that.
I think briefly heard of it, but again, I don't know too much about it.
Oh, okay, yeah. I was just going to say, is there anything like that coming to England as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think I noted in my brief that there's a bit of a difference between urban and rural context with these things. Yeah. In the rural context, it's often about trying to deliver housing for people who are priced out of second homes. It's often about trying to maybe encourage, as I said, self-build, where you've got less pressure on land. And that can really shape your planning policies as a local authority. So, for example, that can make sense in Wales, where there's abundance of relatively cheap land, and there's a real focus on trying to deliver in that country to protect the environment and develop as sustainably as possible. But there's nothing sort of saying that couldn't come to England. In an urban context, it's quite challenging because you're obviously trying to often deliver more units than that. Yeah. And so councils have to balance what might be a great scheme for one person that's an amazing design and really environmentally friendly versus the need to house a lot more people. So there's a lot more sort of, it's a lot more contentious each side. But certainly something like that coming to a rural area, could certainly happen in England.
Thank you.
Cool. So, Alan, do you have a question?
Yeah, I've got a question. I know you're well into like council housing and stuff like that as well, but I know a lot of it's getting like knocked down and stuff like that. It's kind of dwindling, isn't it? Is there any kind of movement of getting that council housing into community-led housing instead of knocking it down or anything like that? Is it like?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. On I think my third slide, I put in brackets tenant management organisations. So these are when tenants of council housing formally request through a legal mechanism to take on the management of their estate. And often from some of my research, these produce sort of better performance in the estate to do with the management. Basically, the people who live there unsurprisingly care a little bit more than maybe the sort of council officers who are looking over all of the stock. And I think that's a really, really integral tool to make sure that estates that do function well, that do provide permanent homes and for people, and do have the right base and should sort of remain, are sort of protected because they're performing in a better way. The tenants have more of a stake in it. Having said that, working for a local authority and under a lot of pressure to deliver housing, there are times in which certain estates, due to maybe the fact that they're not very sustainably built, due to a fact that essentially they take up a really large amount of land space that could be used probably more effectively, sometimes it is the right option to look at redevelopment. And I think when that is the case, community-led housing has a really big step to play in trying to be something on the table there for those residents who really want to take more of a stake in the future of how that estate is shaped and want to have more say in actually what gets built. There are some really bad examples of estate regeneration and some better ones. And I think the projection in London is improving, but I think actually giving tenants more of a say about how that estate regeneration is shaped, and I think community-led housing could be a massive tool in that, is really powerful.
Sweet.
Thank you. I have a question. So let's, Dad, you have one you want to throw in first? So from what I'm understanding, something like a CLT essentially prevents speculation, where if you buy it at one price, you're not expecting it to double in 5 years, and that's managed by the trust because you sell it back to them.
Yeah.
if I purchase a property there, does the value of the property go up with inflation, or am I losing money? Like, is the value of that money going down because I sell it for the same price as I bought it, or does it go up in relative terms to the market, not market, but inflation?
It's a good question. It's a good question. What a lot of people are trying to do within the sector is tie it to local incomes. So there's been big calls from the Labour Party and others in the sort of progressive movement to look at housing affordability, not in terms of any abstract concept of what the market price is, but to look at local incomes. And the community-led housing sector is one of its really standout features is that it does this where nobody else really does. And certainly the community land trust I'm involved with and most that I see try and tie that price difference over time to how local incomes change. So it is perfectly feasible. You're in an area where local incomes go up 200%. It's very, very unlikely. But if it was to be the case, then the price of the CLT homes and the price that you could get for reselling it may well both outstrip the market price and be double what you originally put in. However, as we've seen, particularly since 2008 and the sort of Great Recession, is that wage income has been really, really stagnant, especially compared to inflation. And that's driven up the cost of living. But it also means for products like this that you would probably get only a small fraction of what you would put in compared to if it was just a market sale home.
Cool, thank you. And then my second kind of follow-up question is, so we're talking about taking on, like, you get money from the bank and then you get lent it and you have to pay it back, and obviously you pay it back with some sort of interest that wouldn't be huge.
Yeah.
How is the trust making money, or does it only make the money at the beginning by building properties and selling them, or is there some sort of profit part to the trust somehow that's making ongoing money that's sustaining itself? Like the upkeep of the housing, is that paid service fees, or is that?
Yes, I mean, what's important to understand, and this requires a little bit of knowledge of sort of housing law and property, is that anybody who buys into them won't be a freeholder, they'll be a leaseholder. And there's a whole bunch of complicated stuff, but in essence, what that means is that the community land trust or the co-housing or the cooperative will charge a service charge, and then that will go towards the upkeep and the management. Now, do remember that if you're in a private block and you maybe have your freehold sold to some company out in the Far East, the service charge is going to be probably predicated on the top amount they could possibly charge you. Whereas within a community-led housing setting, there's an honest conversation between everyone who's involved within that community to ask what's a fair price that we should be charging per year for the upkeep of the homes and for everything else that we usually want to do. Community-led housing usually doesn't just, it's not usually just concerned with doing repairs and maybe a paint job every now and again. There's so many initiatives where it's about community gardening, doing voluntary projects, helping the community. And it's just an honest conversation, I guess, about how much you want to charge on a year-to-year basis. As far as I'm aware, there's not a single example of a private community-led housing sort of development, apart from maybe you might classify self-build as that. But generally, all the sort of forms that I talked about are not for profit.
Perfect. I could keep asking questions all day, but I think maybe we'll call it a day there, unless Sol or Ollie, you have any more questions.
Well, I can ask him whenever.
That is very true. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Alex, for that wonderful and informative talk on community-led housing. Let's give him a round of applause.
Yeah, thank you.
Stay safe, stay busy, and tell us a cool story next time we see you.